University. And as you'll see, he's an accomplished photographer, and posts he posts many of his photos on his website, Illinois Botanizer, which you can sign up for. And he's shared many of his photos with us, which we use. So Chris is almost becoming a regular with us, expert on the flora of Illinois. And tonight he's going to talk about not the angiosperms, but the ferns of Illinois. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm glad that we have technology so we can all zoom in and participate, learn a little bit about ferns in Illinois. This is actually a brand new program. If you go to my website, one of the pages has a list of my programs, and this is one I've never done before, so I'm excited to share these photos. So as Jerry said, my name is Chris Benda, and I have current and former affiliations with a lot of the conservation organizations in Illinois. I currently coordinate the Plants of Concern program, which is a rare plant monitoring program where we enlist the help of volunteers to look for and monitor for rare plants. This is through the Chicago Botanic Garden. This year will be my 4th year in that role. You can also find me online as Illinois Botanizer, my website, illinoisbotanizer.com. Social media taken care of. I have some YouTube videos I like to draw people's attention to. And, you know, honestly, the rare plant monitoring is one of many contracts that I have doing rare plant work. But I am essentially a freelance botanist. So if you ever have any botanical needs, let me know and hopefully we can work something out. I moved to Illinois in 2004 to go to graduate school at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and so I've been taking photos in Illinois for 20 years. So that's a long time. So I've been putting those photos on my website, and there's over 1,000 entries now, so you can check those out at your leisure. And I've added a land acknowledgement to all my programs that I think is a worthy endeavor to remind folks that there were other people living here before, Europeans came to this continent, and their maintenance techniques, their relationship with the land was quite different than today. And a lot of, the wonderful diversity and plant communities that we have were developed by those practices. So I think it's worthwhile to acknowledge that, think about it, how things have changed and how we need to protect and save what remains. So before we get into the pictures of ferns of Illinois, I thought I would share a little gee whiz info about ferns. This book here is what is displayed there on the screen. This Robin Moran was a student of Dr. Mullenbrock's here at Southern Illinois University. He had 80 graduate students during his career, and Robin went on to the New York Botanic Gardens. He's a fern expert. He wrote this book. It's it's pretty in depth, but it is a fascinating read. And something at the beginning that I thought was really interesting is he starts off relating ferns with Shakespeare. And in one of his plays here, he says that 2 thieves were talking about a heist, and they said, "We have the receipt of fern seed, and we walk invisible." And they invited another thief to join them, and the other thief said, "Well, I think that you are more beholding to the night than to the fern seed for your walking invisible." And so he goes on to say, what were they talking about? Fern seed. And it basically was because people knew what ferns were. They knew that ferns reproduced, but nobody had ever seen the seeds of ferns. But they knew they must have seeds because the plants were, reproducing. So there was this whole mythology that fern seeds were invisible, and that's why no one had ever seen them. It goes on to say that early herbalists said that you could collect this fern seed on midnight on the summer solstice, the shortest day of the year. At exactly midnight, the fern fell from the plant, and you could catch it by stacking 12 pewter plates beneath the fern leaf. The first seed would fall through the first 11 plates and be stopped by the 12th. And if you came up empty-handed, it was because goblins and fairies roamed freely at that one night of the year, and they snatched the seed as it fell. So, of course, this is fictional works that Shakespeare wrote, and it's an interesting story. And basically, it's saying that we didn't know at that time that ferns reproduce using spores. So John Lindsay in 1794 was in the tropics, and he noticed ferns that were reproducing in fresh, after a fresh rainfall and freshly exposed soil, he saw ferns growing. And he was asked to send some of these to England to be propagated. And he said, well, or he actually learned how to propagate the ferns. And they said, send us some ferns. And he said, well, actually, what would be easier if I just send you some seed, and then in case the ferns die during transport, then this will last longer. And they were all like, oh, he has found the fern seed. How has this person done this? Well, he figured out how to propagate them, but of course they still weren't quite seeds. And it was because of this, the Kew Gardens then and today had the largest collection of living ferns, because John Lindsay here was the early person to figure out how to propagate them. But it was really not until 1848 that another person was able to figure out that ferns reproduced using spores, which of course is very similar to mosses. So that was an interesting story. I have another book here, Ferns of the Coastal Plain, that I like because it talks about, sort of the ethnobotany, the folklore, indigenous uses and things about ferns. So that's another one you may want to be aware of. And I stole this image from that book that shows some of the terminology that is specific for ferns. So if I turn on my pointer here, so we can see basically the stem here, the stalk of the fern from the ground up to the first set of leaves is called the stipe. Right, you see that right over here, where the rest of the stem continuing up where the leaves are is called the rachis. And then we have, of course, the blade of the fern. We have segments of the fern. So their pinnae are basically the segments that are further divided into smaller segments here that are called the pinnules. And then the reproductive structures here on the top, the sori are where the spores are produced, and they send those into the atmosphere. And then often there's a protective covering around the sori, the spore packet, called the indusium. And of course, the whole entire fern can collectively be called a frond. So that reminds me of a joke. If you see ferns growing with any kind of anemones, which are common spring flowers, you say, with fronds like these, who needs anemones?
Oh.
So this slideshow is really a majority of the ferns that can be found in Illinois. And I'll mention if they're common or rare, if they're in northern or southern Illinois or all around, and if they are ones that I think are applicable for home landscaping. So first of all, in Illinois, we have a pretty good diversity. There are 85 taxon. So sometimes a species may be divided into varieties or subspecies. So you wouldn't say that there are 85 species. There's fewer than 85 species, but some of them are divided into smaller groups. That's why we use the term taxon, or taxa is really what it should say. Taxon singular, taxa plural. And then there are lycophytes. Lycophytes are the fern allies. So to me, they don't look like ferns, but they do reproduce using spores. And there are 30 taxa for the lycophytes. Some resources that I will draw to your attention. I mean, this here, the Illustrated Ferns of Illinois, Robert Mullenbrock has an illustrated series. I think there's 16 volumes. There's a whole volume just on ferns. This one is the second edition. It is a very, very excellent book with line drawings and dot maps, of course, dichotomous keys and things. So that's a great resource. I rely on that a lot. There has been a lot of name changing that has happened with ferns of late. So the names that I'm using follow the 2014 publication of Dr. Mullenbrock, that is the Vascular Flora of Illinois. So some of them are have changed, but I'm sure most of you will recognize many of them. A couple other books that I like. So, as Jerry mentioned, I live in Southern Illinois, just south of Carbondale in the little town of Makanda, excuse me, where we just had the wonderful solar eclipse, our second one in 7 years. But this one, the Field Guide to Missouri Ferns, is handy. A lot of the ferns in Illinois, of course, are pretty broad in their distribution. So the adjacent states have the same species. So it's nice sometimes to see other resources, including here the Field Guide to Missouri Ferns and then Ferns and Fern Alleys of Kentucky. Of course, where you're at in Rockford, Northern Illinois, you might want to look and see if I think there's one for Minnesota. I'm not sure about Wisconsin or Iowa. But like I said, often these are tricky things to figure out, and it's useful if you run into a roadblock with one book to look at a different one. And then these are really nice ones too. I got the Midwest Ferns fairly recently. I've only flipped through it a little bit, but the book in the lower right, ferns, spike mosses, club mosses, and quillworts of Eastern North America, just came out. And Emily, from what I read on Facebook, studied at her PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's now at a botanical garden and wrote that book that has had rave reviews. So those are some wonderful resources. So a lot of the photos I'm going to show a photo of the fern, and then I'm going to show a range map. And so this is the key for the range map. And the important things to see here is that if it's that lime green color, that means that fern species has been observed at some point in the past in that county. So the counties are shaded in the light green. If they are yellow, then it's been observed in that county and they're rare. And if it's orange, it's been observed in that county and it's extirpated, meaning no longer present. Those are really the main ones that we will see on the maps. So I thought about a number of ways of arranging this talk. I thought, should I do northern ones first and then southern ones second, or should I do, a number of things? I ended up going alphabetically because that way similar looking ferns are presented in the same group. So I'll go through these alphabetically by family. And again, this is not every single of the 85 plus 30 taxa. We would be here for 2 hours, but there are many, and I'm going to go through them kind of quickly because I want to keep us on track with our time frame. So the spleenwort family is first. Splenium is Greek for spleen. Spleenwort does refer to the doctrine of signatures, where they, postulated that a plant that looked like a body organ was marked by God with his signature that indicated that plant could be used to cure ailments of that body organ, which sounds preposterous if you ask me. And of course, it's not true. We know today, but that was a thought at one time. That's why we have plants like liver leaf and spleenwort, etc. But this one here is a rare fern, Bradley spleenwort fern. Dr. Mullenbrock actually found this in Illinois for the first one to document it at Piney Creek Ravine in 1954. He was looking for the rare shortleaf pine, and he stumbled upon these. I'm actually currently doing a comprehensive survey of all the known locations for this fern with a student who is using a drone. We're trying to fly the drone on cliff faces that are hard to reach by foot and see if we can find any ferns. Honestly, that project has not gone as well using the drone as I had hoped, but we have visited most of the sites for that this fern had been seen at in the past, and it is still present. So you can see it's quite lobed. It grows right out of the sandstone rock. An indicator of this is the rachis. It's black part of the way, and then it turns green. And actually, in the upper surface, you can see it's usually green, but underneath, it's black part of the way. So that's a key character for the Bradley spleenwort. And we can look here. It's throughout a bunch of states, just view in southern Illinois there. And we've actually added Hardin and Pope counties to this map that aren't indicated. But this is we'll go on to a more common splenium. This is Pinnatifid spleenwort fern. This one, you can see it actually has, it's pinnatifid part of the way, which basically means that it's lobed, but the lobes aren't completely dissected all the way to the stem. They're sort of have winged appearance, the winged appearance through the middle of the stem on this. And it's very common on mostly sandstone, but I've seen it on limestone as well. We can see this one here, see some sori produced on that. And it's really, like I said, a pretty common fern in southern Illinois, and you can see most of the counties shaded there. Now, a statewide fern we have here, very common one, is the Asplenium platyneuron, the ebony spleenwort fern. And this grows on rock. It grows right out of the forest floor, the soil. I joke with people. I do a lot of inventories, and I say this is one that you can just check it off your list before you even start your inventory because you know you're going to see it. It's really that common. Um, and you can see here the range map, very common throughout the Midwest and the Eastern United States, as well as Illinois, north to south. Now, one that's very similar to that, that is rare, is this one here, Asplenium resiliens. And the thing that is distinct about this, that it has this sort of gray, sort of bluish gray color to it. And I've done surveys for this plant in February where it really stands out. You know, most things are brown and there's other ferns, but they're really much greener than this one. I'll show you a picture here of the sori that you can see, and it's got, this is called black stemmed or black spleenwort fern. It has a rachis that's black, you know, the entire length. And you can see the leaflets, the pinnae, they have an auricle or a little thumb. They look like a boot. And that is, you know, we'll separate this from some of the other aspleniums. And for the most part, they're arranged in pairs. Sometimes they can get a little bit offset, but for the most part, they're in pairs, where in the ebony spleenwort fern, the previous photo, they're alternate. So that's one big difference between the two. And this only grows on, well, actually, there's a sandstone site. It's mostly on limestone. So that was a fun one to do surveys for. It's just Jackson, Union, and Alexander County, and we've confirmed this fern. There's only 5 locations for it that have ever been found. I've visited them all. The fern is present at all of them. So that's exciting that that fern is doing just fine. Now, this was a wild one here, Asplenium rhizophyllum. So rhizo for root, phyllum for leaf, which is a good name for the walking fern, which is named that because it can reproduce vegetatively. The frond will taper to a point, and that point, the tip of the fern can re-root in the soil and then advance another frond from that. And if you see my finger in the lower right, I actually have my finger underneath the tip of the fern, and I'm pulling up on it, and you can to show that it's rooted. The tip is re-rooting into the substrate. I always see this fern on rock and on vertical rock for the most part, but it is pretty common across the landscape, at least in southern Illinois. But you can see there's populations in northern Illinois too. Castle Rock State Park, of course, is where we have the George Fell Nature Preserve, and that's a wonderful place to go look at not only ferns, but also fern allies. Let's move on here. This is one of my favorites. I'm always excited when I run across the maidenhair spleenwort fern. So the leaflets there, the pinnae, they look like a maidenhair leaf. So like ginkgo is called the maidenhair tree, or we have later in the slideshow, I'll have the actual maidenhair fern, and it's describing sort of that fan shape. But you can see these are paired as well, but they don't have that auricle. There's no little lobe or thumb attached to the leaves, but the rachis is still black. I would call this like spider fern or something. It looks like it has a lot of legs that sort of radiate from a central axis, the Asplenium trichomones. So all the Aspleniums here, I would say, and then you can see this range on that is just in southern Illinois. Actually, this was a fern that I read in the Wisconsin Botanical Club that was relocated just in the recent, you know, the last couple of years. Somebody found it at a preserve in Wisconsin, and it hadn't been seen in a long time. So that's kind of exciting. Maybe, you know, Wisconsin's not too far from Rockford. Maybe something that'll pop up somewhere where no one had seen it before. So all the aspleniums there, they grow on rock for the most part, except for the ebony spleenwort. So I haven't really seen them in the landscape trade, but those are. Oh, and I should also mention the aspleniums are very promiscuous. They hybridize a lot, and the book has 5 or 6 hybrids listed. So I didn't include any of those. I have seen some hybrids, but they can get to be tricky to identify. Now let's go into the mosquito fern family, the Azolaceae, for Azolla. And there's a little bit of taxonomy issues here. I think this is probably Azolla caroliniana, but if you follow Molenbrock's book, he lists it as Mexicana. In any event, it is an aquatic fern. The brown specks on the surface of the water in the main photo, those are all the ferns floating on the surface. And of course, I have one in my hand, so you can see the fern there. And this is actually a nitrogen fixer. And so it's a really important plant. In fact, this plant, it reproduces very quickly. And so not only was it producing nitrogen, it was producing oxygen. And the proliferation of this plant was believed to, have contributed to Earth being inhabitable basically by, animals that really contributed to some of the common gases that we need and rely on in the atmosphere. So we look at the range there. It's common in the swamps in southern Illinois. You can see it creeps up the Mississippi River all the way, up into Minnesota. So that's always a neat one. I love to see that. In some years, I think it's years where there's environmental stress, the ferns actually turn pink, like in the early spring. I haven't seen this myself, but I've heard about it and I've seen photos of just the surface of the water would just be pink from the mosquito fern, which grows in swamps where the mosquitoes thrive, hence the name. All right, let's move on to the Blacknacea, the chain fern family, because we have the netted chain fern. This is probably my favorite fern, and I don't know why. I just really like it. It wasn't commonly encountered. I remember, when I learned it the first time I saw it. Um, Usually, it grows on rock faces, and wet rock faces. But I have seen a few places, a few counties where it will grow in large expanses in the forest, just on the forest floor, in where it's a little bit wetter in places. So I don't have a great close up of the fern, but for the most part, the pinnae are arranged alternate, and they have a pronounced wing to it. This is one of the ferns. A lot of the ferns, like we saw earlier in the picture I showed, the sori, the reproductive structures, are produced on the underside of the leaves. Other ferns have a completely separate frond in which produce the spores, and that's the case for the Woodwardia and some other ones. So the green leaves that we see here, we would call the sterile fronds. And then later in the year, it puts up a special frond that's called the fertile frond that contains the spore bearing structures. So we look at that one again. It's really just a few counties in southern Illinois and farther south. Now we have the hay-scented fern family. Oh, this is one that I always have trouble pronouncing, trouble spelling. Denstediaceae, I guess, something like that. But here's a picture there. This is actually Illinois. I don't know if it's endangered or threatened, but a listed species that grows on, it's in a number of canyons that we have. So Denstadia punctilobula, or punctilobula, I guess I would say. And we can see here the sori underneath when they're on the leaves of the fern, they're usually underneath, and they're diagnostic. You can really use them to help figure out what the plant might be. And this one, you can see they are small, round sori, and it's got quite of a kind of a hairy stem. I've never really gotten the hay scent out of this, but I haven't seen it that many times. This is, if you look at the map here, so it's really on the edge of its range in southern Illinois. Like I said, it's in canyons in Polk County and such. It's got one record there in Ogle County, so one in northern Illinois, but you can see it's common out east. So the edge of its range here. Now, this one here is a bracken fern, Pteridium aquilinum. This is, for lack of a better term, kind of a weedy fern, I would say. There's definitely some sites that this fern can just take off and grow in, large numbers in the forest floor. I don't see it that much, honestly, in the southern part of the state, but I know for one reason, like at Indiana Dunes, it's a very common plant. What I would draw your attention to is, I could bring my cursor back. Right here, I'm showing, this is where the stem comes out of the ground, and it terminates here, and then there's a frond that goes one direction, and a frond that goes the other direction, and then another frond that goes up. So it's really distinct and easy to identify because it has that sort of three-parted appearance to it. And if we go ahead and look at the range there, it's pretty common throughout eastern North America. There's a big gap there in the west, and then it's got counties, out in the far west. So it makes you kind of think maybe there's two varieties here, two species lurking but that is the current range. And then in Minnesota, the purple is saying that it's exotic. It's not considered native there, which is kind of bizarre, but that's what the color means. Let's move on. So this is a large family: the Dryopteridaceae, the shield ferns or the wood ferns. Ethereum felix femina is a lady fern. We have a couple species in Illinois. They have a very delicate look to them, I would say. But a lot of the ferns in the Dryopteridaceae, the shield fern family, look very similar. And that's where looking at the sori is helpful. On this one, you can see the sori are long and lean, and the indusium kind of opens like a hot dog bun. That's what I like to describe to my students. So the shape of the sori and the sort of pointed leaflets help describe or put an ID for this particular fern. Pretty common across Illinois. There's a northern and a southern one, so that would be the range for the more northern lady fern, and then this one here, the southern variety, Asplenioides. Let's go into the Cystopteris group. This is also a large common group of ferns. This here is one of my favorite ferns, the bulblet fern, Cystopteris bulbifera. This fern has very long fronds and they taper to a point, and that is really, I think, helpful identification clue for this. Because there are other fragile ferns, but they don't have these really long, drawn out, tapering fronds like this. But the really interesting thing and useful clue to see to identify them is to look for the bulblets. So these are little bulbs produced along the stem that will fall off and can generate a new fern. It's a form of asexual reproduction. So if you see those bulbs, for fern, for sure you have the bulblet fern. And this one also likes, it seems like shaded, moist canyons kind of things. I did a survey at Franklin Creek Natural Area in Lee County, and this was a pretty common fern there because it's very canyon-like in that natural area. We look at the range there, lots of places in northern Illinois for it, down the Mississippi River, and then I've seen it a number of times in southern states or southern counties of Illinois as well, but not so much there in the prairie region, the middle. Another Cystopteris, this is the common fragile fern, Cystopteris protrusa. It grows early in the spring. It can form dense patches. It's really like a light colored green, I would say. I don't have a picture of the sori, but they're round. And it's fragile because it's fragile to frost. So this is a fern that will disappear quickly when temperatures plummet in the fall. Whereas a lot of our ferns are really kind of evergreen. They are often visible throughout the wintertime, particularly in southern Illinois where we don't get freezing temperatures very often. We look at the fragile fern. Every single county in Illinois has had a observation for the fragile fern. And then I put this one in here because I mentioned I did a survey at Lee County, and this is one of only a few places in Illinois where the Laurentian bladder fern was found. And actually, the aforementioned Robin Moran found it, collected it, and he's the only one that's ever seen it at Franklin Creek. I corresponded with him for my survey. Unfortunately, he collected it prior to the days of GPS, and he really didn't recall anything to help me try and locate it. So I tried to look for a different looking, like a bladder fern that looked different, and I was not able to relocate it. So we do consider this to be an extirpated species in Illinois at the current time. But moving on, here's another beautiful one. So this looks like it would be fun for landscaping. I'm not sure if I've seen it in any landscaping, but the silvery spleenwort fern is very large fern. It's very hairy. You can see the leaflets here. We'll go to the next picture. They're pretty much rounded. They're not very toothed, but again, they have those long and linear sori and indusium that look like little hot dog buns, and that's a useful characteristic to separate it out from the similar looking Dryopteris, which I will go into soon. So we see that it's actually statewide. So there's maybe a third or so of the counties in Illinois have had that documented there. The Paria acrosticoides. I'm not sure why they call it this spleenwort fern, and if it has some resemblance to it, it doesn't look like it to me. So that's why common names are sometimes confusing, which actually leads into this one. Diplasium pycnocarpon, they call glade fern. I've always thought of a glade as a treeless area. So like the Everglades in Florida or like a mountain glade in Vermont, you might ski through a glade, or we have sandstone glades in southern Illinois, large expanses of open rock. I don't see this fern in any of those places, so I'm not sure why they call it that. But sword fern is another name for it. I think sword fern is makes sense. You look at the leaves there, they don't have any divisions really. They're entire and they taper to a point. And so that's pretty distinct um, for that one. The previous one and this one are both considered C10s. So of course that's the conservation value. That means that you only find these ferns in intact, pristine or nearly pristine natural communities. And we see the range there actually statewide as well, but not contiguously. Mostly southern Illinois, a little band there and through central and then Chicago region. Now let's do the Dryopteris. This is a large genus. They have round sori and large fronds. This here is the Dryopteris carthusiana, spinulose wood fern. And this one is really also in damp, shaded canyons, moist areas. In southern Illinois, it grows with other glacial relics like club moss and bishop's cap and cinnamon fern and plants that were pushed south by the glaciers and persisted after they were refugia during the climate during glacial times, and then persisted when the plants migrated back north. So you can see they have a very delicate sort of frilly look to the leaves, I would say, with the little teeth and the round sori. And the sori are, they're not near the edges of the leaf, which is useful for comparing to another fern, which I'll bring up soon. So we see the range there. Again, we call it a glacial relic in southern Illinois because it is really a northern species and it only persists in southern counties because of glaciation, with forced plants to migrate south, and they persist in shaded, moist microclimate areas. Now, a really rare one here, Illinois endangered. This is my friend Nick. He's the ecologist at the Shawnee National Forest. He's president of the Illinois Native Plant Society Southern Chapter, and we went to go look for these. They grow at Heron Pond. John Schwegman found these during his career, and I'm not super clear on really pointing out the differences here, and I don't have great diagnostic photos, but I did want to mention that this is a fern that is rare in Illinois, and it is extant. It's still occurring. I think we were there 2 years ago. Call it log fern. So if you look at the picture, look at that. It's not very common throughout its range, and it's got one county indicated in Illinois, Johnson County. Of course, that is where Heron Pond Nature Preserve is located. Now this one here, I guess I said earlier, netted chain fern is one of my favorites, the Woodwardia. This one is a strong contender for Chris's favorite fern, the Goldie's fern, Dryopteris goldiana. And this is actually one that we've we've discussed with listing as endangered or threatened in Illinois. And the current thought is that maybe there's enough of it to not list it, but it is pretty uncommon and it does occur statewide. So let's look at another photo here. The fronds are large, and each individual pinnae, they're large as well. And then you can look at the sori. They are in the interior part of the leaf, and again, they are round. So this would be a fantastic one for home landscaping. And I have to tell you honestly, I live in a small cottage in the woods. We have natural forest vegetation all the way up to our house. So I don't do any landscaping. I do not own a lawnmower. I have a little weed whacker I use and a leaf blower. So I enjoy just letting the plants of the woods, naturally occur. I haven't incorporated very many plants myself. I'm not really a landscaper, but I definitely could see the utility of that. And I do encourage people to use native plants for their landscaping, and ferns are quite beautiful. So I do encourage everyone here to seek out some of these and see if you can find them and incorporate them in your home landscaping. And this is a really spectacular one. So we see the range in Illinois, north and south, really. So if you're out and about looking at ferns this coming year, see if you can find a Goldie's fern. There's actually a paper that Rick Philippi and Paul Markham put out that you may be able to find, and it would list some of the locations across the state for this one. I've found a number of new locations in my plants of concern work in the last 2 years. Now, another one that does occur also north and south in Illinois is the Dryopteris intermedia. I think I've seen it as intermediate wood fern. This is common wood fern. It's not that common to me, but the Dropteris intermedia and Dropteris carthusiana are two that I often confuse. I would say that the intermedia, the leaves there, you look at the pinnae and the pinnules, they're not as frilly. They're not as toothed. They're rounded and there's, divisions and lobes, but they're not quite as toothy. And again, you can see the round sori are closer to the interior portion of the leaf. So that's that one. We can see the range there again, mostly northern, mostly southern Illinois, and then some counties in the middle. I imagine that a lot of these Dryopteris ferns can be found in the nursery trade or can be obtained in some way or another, and you can plant them at your home. We'll move on to the most common one here, the Dryopteris marginalis. So they call it marginal shield fern, and when I lead tours, I always joke with people and say, "Oh, when my presentation's over, if you say Chris's presentation was marginal, my feelings might be hurt a little bit, and this fern's feelings might be hurt by calling it marginal. So I joke and call it exceptional shield fern. Um, but of course, wood fern is another name for this, and you can see that it has very rounded leaflets, and they're not toothed, but really the key to identification here, and the reason they call it marginal shield fern, is that the sori are produced along the margins or the edges of the leaves. Where on all the other Dryopteris, they were pretty close to the interior of the leaf. So that is a useful characteristic for the marginal shield fern. And we can see the range there again, pretty much statewide, perhaps more common in southern Illinois, but there's counties up north. There's Lee and Ogle shaded there. And then, of course, the ubiquitous Christmas fern. I would say probably the most common fern, definitely in southern Illinois, but probably statewide. It is a beautiful one. It does stay green year round. That's why they call it Christmas fern. People used to make wreaths for Christmas with this one since it stays green. I like to joke and say that the pinnae, each individual leaflet, if you will, it also has an auricle. It has a little thumb or what I would call a boot. So I say it's like Santa Claus's boot or like a stocking you would hang from the mantle at Christmas time. So other references to Christmas. And it's Polystichum acrosticoides is the name. We look at the range there, very common throughout its range, very contiguous in its distribution, and it does creep up into northern Illinois and up into Wisconsin. This is a common fern. You go to pine stands here in the Cheyenne National Forest, and sometimes there's nothing growing in there but pine needles and Christmas fern. So I kind of consider it a weed, if you will, but it is a native fern, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I just mean that in a way, meaning that it's most successful in degraded habitats. It really grows well in places that have been degraded. Let's move on here to Woodsia. We actually have two Woodsias up in the Rockford region, and a little farther south there in Ogle County, you have a different Woodsia that's Ilvensis. They call the rusty Woodsia. I've never observed that, and if I have, I didn't know that I was because I'm confused on it, to be honest with you. I'm not sure how to identify it, but it is one that has been recorded in Illinois. It's quite rare, but this is the more common one, and it does occur statewide here. The thing that is helpful for identification of Woodsia is that it has a chaffy stipe. So the stipe again is the stalk of the fern, and it has like scales that are on it. So it's got this chaffy look to it. And you can see the sori there. They're round and the leaves are quite toothed. The range map there. A lot of counties in southern Illinois, but it does creep up into the northern parts as well. So again, keep your eye out for the rusty Woodsia and send me a photo if you think you find it, because I'd love to learn that one a little bit better. Let's move on here. Now this one is super cool. It's only in southern Illinois, but it's cool wherever you go across its range. It's the filmy fern family. We have one of the filmy ferns is actually, it only really expresses itself as a gametophyte. And so I'm not going to explain the life history of ferns, but they're similar to mosses, where there's a slight alternation of generations, right? The gametophyte stage, the sporophyte phase. The gametophytes are one set of chromosomes or haploid, and then the sporophytes are diploid, two sets chromosomes. This is one that Robin Moran says it looks like green steel wool. I've had other people say it looks like pool felt. So it's really small and it doesn't look like much and it's hard to identify. And we have seen this at a number of places. I think this map is this is an overlooked fern, I think. It's not on the endangered list in Illinois. I think maybe it should be. This map only has Pope and Jackson counties indicated, but I think it's more widespread than that. It's just, like I said, it's really easily overlooked and hard to identify. But the cousin to it is the other filmy fern, Vandenboschia boschiana. This used to be in the genus Trichomonas. And the fern here, each leaf is only one cell layer thick. So they kind of have a translucent look to them. This is one that actually one of the early botanists, or one of the sort of a botanist that made huge observations and huge documentation of plants in Illinois was Bob Evers, who was at the Illinois Natural History Survey. And I don't know, I heard somebody say that for many years in his career, he collected plants in all 102 counties in Illinois every year. So, and this was in the 50s and 60s. So he really traveled the state a lot. And his job was basically to document flora and make collections. He made a lot. And he has a 1960 or 58 publication of all the filmy fern spots that he knew of at that time. And John Schwegman repeated that study in 1999, and he visited all the ones that Dr. Evers knew about, and then he added some. And now it's been 25 years since that 99 publication. So one of these days in all my free time, I would love to reproduce that report and have an update about this fern, because this is one that it only occurs in the deep, dark recesses of sandstone overhangs for the most part. There's a couple places where it actually grows in the full sun, in like a vertical crack in a sandstone. But most of the populations, you have to get down on your hands and knees and shine a flashlight way back into the recesses of a sandstone overhang or bluff and see the fern, back in there. So you think, how is it even getting enough sunlight to photosynthesize? But it is another sort of glacial relic plant. It was more common when the climate was cooler, and it persists in these, moist shaded microclimates. And we look at the range here. I'm actually happy. It's just 3 counties in Illinois. I think I've been to all of the locations except one. And this last year, we actually documented a county record near the Panther Den Wilderness in Union County. It was found. So we can add a new county to our distribution, bringing the total to 4. And I think there's only about 17 now populations in the state. But a lot of them look very similar to what they looked like, 70 years ago when Dr. Evers was doing his study. So it kind of makes me think, is it really endangered? Because it certainly seems to be persisting for the most part. There are some sites where it doesn't look as good as it used to, but for the most part, it is still there. All right, let's move on here. This is a really bizarre one. This is the kind of thing that I say people smarter than me determine that this is a fern ally, fern-like plant. So this is called water clover. It is non-native. I've actually seen this not very often, but one great place to view it is at the War Bluff, Illinois Audubon Sanctuary in Pope County near Golconda. My friend used to be the site steward there, and he lived at their housing, and they had it growing in the pond there, and it's quite beautiful. And I don't know if it's really considered invasive or not, because it does. I haven't seen it a lot, but where I have seen it, there's always a lot of it, and it floats on the surface of the water. Here, it's indicated in blue because, again, it is a non-native fern. Let's see, they don't even have Polk County on that map, which is interesting. These maps aren't perfect, and I do have permission, by the way, to share these from the BONAP site. So again, these maps aren't perfect, but they are sort of the best visual representation that we have, rather than without making our own maps. It shows the whole range in North America for these. All right, let's move on to the Onocliaceae. It's the sensitive fern family. So you could say Onoclea or Onoclea sensibilis, I would say, for the sensitive fern. Similar to Woodwardia, but the leaflets are pretty much paired. They do have separate fertile fronds from we're looking at the sterile fronds here. They have separate fertile fronds here. Let's go to another picture. You can see the rachis is winged. The leaflets are arranged in pairs across the stem, and then we can see the dried up sporangia on the fertile frond on the right side of the photo. Robin Moran actually taught fern ID. My friend told me this joke that he shared where he said, when do you go looking for sensitive fern? On a Clea day, because it's the genus Onoclea. And sensitive because it's sensitive to frost. So often we'll go back to this picture. You can see the fertile fronds there on the right side. They persist through the winter, but the actual sterile fronds, they wither away in the first frost. So we see that one very common statewide. It generally grows in moist habitats. Again, I haven't seen it in the nursery trade, but I think it's probably available, and that would be a fun one to include, especially because of the fertile fronds that persist through the wintertime, add a little structure to the garden. And then here we have ostrich fern. And of course, ostrich fern is probably the most landscaped fern that we have in Illinois and beyond. I've seen this in a lot of people's landscaping. I was talking to someone the other day who suggested that there are some varieties that are not great to plant in Illinois. So if you are going to use this one, you might want to do a little research about finding the appropriate cultivar for your region. It has a hard to pronounce name, but we'll just go with ostrich fern. Here's one we don't get in Southern Illinois. This is in Northern Illinois. I think the first time I saw this fern was at Mississippi Palisades State Park in Carroll County. So that would be a great one to look into for use in landscaping. And then here we have the fun Ophioglossacea, the adder's tongue family. And it has more than just adder's tongues in it. We have rattlesnake fern. You know, people were fascinated with snakes. One of the Coastal Plain book I have talks about the term snake being used for lots of plants, and they feared snakes. They were also fascinated by snakes, and a lot of plants were thought to be used to cure snake bites. But this is basically in the grape fern group. And like the bracken fern, it has a main stem that comes up to the ground and stops there, and then one frond one way, one frond another way, another frond a third way. So they split off and branch into threes. It is a very small little fern, like a half a sheet of paper size or so. And then this little brown dried up part here, those are where the sori were. So they have the reproductive structures that come off the top of the plant. You see the range there? Every single county in Illinois and beyond. So a very common fern is the rattlesnake fern. But here are the true adder's tongues. So Ophio is Latin for snake and glossum is Latin for tongue. So it's a good name to call it adder's tongue. Adder is another word for a snake. This one is the rare Engelmannii. They might as well call this limestone adder's tongue fern because it always grows on limestone where I've seen it on thin limestone soils in full sun. And often it has this little notch, this little point at the top of the leaf. And that's a useful characteristic. Between that and finding it on limestone are really the key identification ones, because otherwise it looks similar to the more common one, which is coming up. We look at the map here. It's really in, hill prairies, limestone glades in the southern part of the state. But here we have the common adder's tongue fern. So this just grows out of the forest floor. It's very common right now. It likes the spring and it'll wither away by midsummer. I've been seeing a lot of this fern around. So if you just saw the leaf, you might think, well, that doesn't look fern-like, but then you can see the sort of the snake tongue part, the reproductive stalk that comes up in the leaf, and that looks more fern-like. So we look at the range there. Again, still sort of restricted to the southern half of Illinois, but more common than the other one. And then we have these other grape ferns. So Septridium bidernatum. These used to be in the genus Botrychium. The ones that stayed in Botrychium are really rare in Illinois, and they're more in the northern part, and I haven't seen many of those. But this is a rare one in southern Illinois. Just has a few fronds, and really the edges of the leaves look like a hacksaw blade. And that's those serrations are a useful diagnostic feature. You see I actually don't think this one's all that rare, but I'm still doing work to determine where it's extant so we can maybe delist it. We'll move on here to the much more common Septridium dissectum. So we have variety dissectum in the lower part of the photo and variety obliquum in the top part of the photo. You can see the dissectum is very dissected, very frilly. That's a form. It's actually just a different form. It's not even a subspecies or a variety of Septridium dissectum. We'll go on to this one. This is obliquum. This is the much more common one, and you can see it's much more blunt. It has lots of lobes, not very divided in tooths like the previous photo. but it produces a separate stalk that has the sporangia on them, the spore bearing parts, and they're round and they look like little grapes basically, and that's why they call it grape fern. Another name for this is bronze fern, or cut leaved grape fern is another name, because the leaves turn brown in the wintertime, hence the name bronze fern. And the maps are really hard to, they're not split out between forms and varieties and things. So this is just collectively Septridium dissectum on the map, and you can see there pretty much statewide and to the north and to the east. Let's move on. The royal fern family. I love these. Cinnamon fern is one of my favorite plants. Huge leaves, and again, they have separate. So these leaves, I think you could confuse with Dryopteris, with the wood ferns. But the wood ferns have the sori, the spores produced on the underside of the leaves, where these have a whole separate fertile frond, and the fertile frond looks like a cinnamon stick, the little brown structure there. So the cinnamon fern is a good name for that. This has actually been reclassified as a mundustrum. If you guys are updated on your taxonomy, but you can see there again, most common in northern Illinois, southern Illinois, but not so much in the prairie region. Another one that's similar is the Osmunda claytonia, the interrupted fern, which is a good name for it. You can see that these sori are actually produced on the stem of the main frond, but in the middle. So the fern is interrupted by not producing any leaflets in the middle, and then it has little brown spore-bearing parts, the fertile parts of the fern. Otherwise, it does look very similar to cinnamon fern, and you often see these growing together. Again, at the George Fell Nature Preserve, at Castle Rock State Park, you can see huge expanses of interrupted fern and cinnamon fern growing together right out of the forest floor. Just beautiful, beautiful ferns. And it is more common in the north. There's a few southern Illinois counties. I've never seen it down here, but I have seen it in northern Illinois. And then, of course, the spectacular royal fern. I think this is also now Osmunda spectabilis, because it's spectacular for sure. And it has a different leaflet. So the other ones, weren't as divided into segments like this, and they had rounded segments. So these were like rounded teeth, and these are basically entire. They're smooth edge, but lots of different divisions, big leaves, and of course that separate fertile frond with the brown spore structures on it. And this one I usually see in seeps, at least in the southern part of the state, and in the northern part, it does grow in wet places, but it may be more out of the forest floor than in, fully wet places or on rock. So the royal fern, aptly named, we are among royalty. So let's move on. I have more I want to share with you. Resurrection fern is a neat one. This is one of my favorite scientific names to pronounce. It's Pleopeltis polypodioides. And they call it resurrection fern because the picture on the right, you can see that when they're dried up, they kind of curl up. But then when it rains and they're wet, they're resurrected and they unfurl. You can see on the picture on the left, I'm showing the underside of the leaf. The large round circles are the sori, the spore-bearing parts. But then you can see the leaves are covered in scales, little brown scales covering the leaves. And that separates this out from the next one that I'm going to talk about. So this one is restricted to southern Illinois and farther south. But it used to be in the genus Polypodium, hence polypodioides means similar to Polypodium. And here's the Polypodium virginianum. So this one's very similar. Look at another picture here. So again, those large, round, brown spots are the sori, where the spores come out of, but the leaves are not covered in scales underneath. So that's how you separate these two similar looking ferns. They call it polypody fern, right? Poly for many, pody for feet, so many feet, referring to the root system on this. And it grows in large expanses, always on rock. And we can see this again. A lot of these ferns, southern Illinois, northern Illinois, but there's not as many ferns there in the prairie region of central Illinois. We'll move on to the maidenhair family. And this is Adiantum pedatum, the maidenhair fern. It is so beautiful. Of course, this one is definitely available for landscaping. A lot of people do incorporate it in their home landscape, which they should. It is wonderful. You can see the fan shape of the leaflets, hence the name, the maidenhair fern. And we can see here every single county in Illinois again. So great native fern for our state. And some other ones in this group, I love seeing the baby lip fern. So we have hairy lip fern and baby lip fern. The baby lip fern is now Myriopteris gracilis, but the old name was Cheilanthes fii. It typically grows on limestone. So I took this at LaRue Pine Hills. I know I've seen it up in, like Carroll County along the Mississippi River. It's woolly, but it's white woolly hairs on it. And then we can see the range there along the cliffs of the Mississippi River, basically southern Illinois, and then extreme northwestern Illinois. It looks like it's at Joe Davis County, Carroll County. Much more common is the hairy lip fern. This is now Myriopteris lanosa. I think I might have misspoke before. One of these has brown woolly hairs. The other one has white. I kind of forget which is which, but that tells the two apart because they are both pretty hairy, and so that's why they call this one hairy lip fern. And this one usually grows in big expanses where it's really dry. So look at that. It's in Ogle County, but otherwise it's restricted to southern Illinois. Now here we have purple cliffbrake fern, which is one that I always enjoy seeing as well. It's typically on limestone, but I do see it on sandstone sometimes. You can see there it has this one, the Atropurpurea, has hairs on the stem. You usually have to look under magnification to see those hairs. The fertile fronds sometimes look a little bit different, but they are green and photosynthesize. We can see the range there, mostly southern Illinois and Ogle County. I did see this at Franklin Creek State Natural Area. And very similar is the Palea glabella, the smooth cliffbrake fern. So they look almost the same, but this one will not have any hairs on the stem. But also found, this looks like this picture here is on sandstone, but often you see these on limestone. We look at the range there. This one is much more common in northern Illinois than the previous Atropurpurea species, and then along the Mississippi River as well. Okay, now there's another family, the Thalipteridaceae, the Thalipteris family. Here is an interesting one because this is another non-native fern in Illinois, and it is really moving around in the southern part of the state. I don't know much about up in the north if it's there, moved around, but I see it a lot. It's one that is also sort of like the bracken fern, where it branches, has a main stem, and it branches and branches again. It's a large fern, a big clump. You can see the sori there, round towards the middle of the stem, making it look like a Dryopteris, but it's the way it's so branching would really suggest otherwise. So this is macro Thalipteris torresciana. I think it's Torresiana. I think the C in there is a typo. And then we have, this is a Illinois endangered species, the Phagopteris connectilis. I've never seen this species until last year or 2 years ago at, again, George Fell Nature Preserve at Castle Rock State Park. It's a good place to see it. I try to take a selfie with the rare plants whenever I get a chance, and I did have a chance here on this one. They're growing. I'm standing like in a creek bottom, and they're growing on the edge of a bluff there. So this long beach fern, rare in Illinois, common to the north, common to the east. And I've just seen it that one time in Ogle County. But the much more common, this is another fun Latin name to say, or botanical name. This is Phagopteris hexagonoptera. This is the broad beach fern, and this one's easy to ID because if you look at the lowest two pinnae, they're pointed inwards. So on both photos, you can see the lowest set of leaflets, they really are curved and point inward on the plant. You can see that there. It often grows in large expanses, pretty much statewide. And again, I'm not sure about landscaping potential for this, but I think it would be a good one if you could find it in the trade. And then I wanted to mention the New York fern. I have never seen. It's also rare in Illinois. So there is one site in Polk County that I know it's been seen at, and me and Nick, who was in the slideshow earlier, are going to try and track that down. That's down in southern Polk County in the Cretaceous Hills. So I haven't seen that one yet, but that gives you an idea of its range. The much more common one in this genus is the marsh fern, Thalipteris palustris. And as palustris implies, it is grows in wet places, so fens and wetlands and such. You can see the sori produced on the leaves there. They look pretty distinct. And we'll move on to the range there, mostly northern Illinois for this one, again in wetlands, but a few counties farther south. And we'll go there. So, how are we doing on time? I'm going a little bit long. So you want me to go through the lycophytes here, or you want to wrap it up there?
We should probably wrap it up pretty quick.
Okay, that sounds good. Let's do
We
that.
have to be out of the library in 20 minutes.
Okay, well, that's good. So there are some other ferns that are fern allies that reproduce with spores, and I won't go through them all, but you've probably heard of horsetails and club mosses and lycopodiums and all these other names. So there are about 30 of those, and they're kind of neat as well. And I wanted to include those. So I'll just go all the way to the end here. Whoops. And conclude with the final slide here. Bring it back up. So feel free to email me. IllinoisBotanizer.com is the website. My email's listed there. You know what I'm saying is true because you can trust me. I'm a botanist. So
Okay, so we are recording this, and this will be available on our YouTube channel, on our website, but we're converting our website, so you might want to wait a couple weeks before you look for it. If you have a question, either in the audience or online, if you're online, you can either mute yourself and ask your question or put it in the chat.
I do see one question here in the chat. Do many ferns hybridize? And a number of ferns do. I mentioned the Asplenium ferns, the spleenworts, they hybridize a lot. There's probably 6 or so hybrids listed in the book. There are a couple in the Dryopteris genus as well, the wood ferns. But otherwise, as far as naturally occurring wild plants in Illinois, those are the main ones that come to mind that have hybrids.
Kim, what point in the growing season do they get spores? And what kind of ferns do they put in flower?
Okay, what time of the year do they normally get their spores? And you probably don't know the answer to this. Which ferns are commonly used in flower arrangements
Mm-hmm.
in the florist trade?
Well, yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I would think the Christmas fern would be used to so common and it stays green and such, but offhand, I can't think of what I've observed myself in floral arrangements. As far as the sori, they're sort of like, flowers in the sense that the plant usually grows and greens up, and then the flowers come a little bit later. So the sori are produced after the leaves are expanded, typically later in the year, but they do persist quite a while. So they're easy to identify, very late in the year.
Hey, Vlad, do you have a question you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, Chris. I was wondering about rachises and like some of the keys mentioned rachises being scaly or hairy or glandular. And I've been kind of confused because I've seen some that look like hairs, but they're actually like, I know what the species is and it says it's scaly in the key. Like can scales ever be hair-like, and like what does that generally look like? And what would you how would you tell if something is glandular?
So a glandular, as the name implies, has a little gland on it, and usually it's like sometimes it can be a hair with a pointed tip. So I always think of like a sewing pin where you have an expanded head on it. Or if it's just without not attached to a stalk or a hair, then it looks like a water droplet. It's just like a little blob that would be on the stem. I would say the hairs should look hairy in that they're thin and wispy, versus a scale is usually brown and they're wider and they look more like leaf tissue than they look like a hair. So those come to mind in looking at those. But some of the fern terminology is different than on our other herbaceous plants, and it's specific to ferns, and it can be quite confusing. There's definitely much more that I need to learn regarding that as well. And I do find the keys somewhat tricky in some of the terminology. So I hope that gives you a little bit of helpful information.
Thank you.
Okay, no more questions? And I
If
think
anybody in the chat room or online would like to ask Chris a question, I'm sure he'd be willing to address it in his email.
Yeah, and
I'm
contact him.
opening you up to that. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely. Yep. I get a lot of correspondence and, you know, I want people to be excited about our wild vegetation and I make sure to answer every email request that I get and I welcome them. So hit me up if you have any other thing else.
Okay. What is the relationship, of anything, of ferns with other plants in the landscape?
Sometimes they shade them out, but they, that's about it.